Okay, so I'm Michelle Belanger, and I am an author of many books, both fiction and nonfiction, and also a creator of games. And I'm here because there is a fun intersection between uh, Gothic and diversity and just this whole sort of collaborative storytelling. Unless you live under a rock, which my wife does, so no judgment. You may have heard of role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons, Critical Role. Like there's been like this renaissance of interest in gaming. Um, more than just computer games or Pokemon, and gaming is a huge, big umbrella, but we're going to focus on gaming that are role-playing, that basically role-playing games are collaborative storytelling. It's probably the simplest definition we can have for what is a role-playing game. If, like me, you've been playing role-playing games since you were 10, you've probably hit the point in your career, lifestyle, or profession where trying to get a gaming group to sit around a table to role-play is nigh impossible. Even with all of the options of doing stuff online, it's just so hard to keep a group together. And we think of role-playing games as collaborative storytelling among a group of people, and that is absolutely one part of it. But in recent years, there's been this really fascinating development of solo role-playing games, and particularly, and this is going to be the topic that we'll dig into, journaling games. So a journaling role-playing game is a solo game where it's kind of the best of a bunch of writing prompts and a collaborative story that you can insert either yourself or a character into. It leans into fan fiction because there's no limits for like who you play in it. You can do alternate universe stuff. And probably, I would be remiss if I didn't say like this, probably the poster child book, especially for Gothic vampire journaling games, is Thousand Year Old Vampire by Tim Hutchings, which he was writing before the pandemic, but this probably took off partly because it came together at a point where everybody was really shut in and had the time to dig into like this is a whole book of prompts where you play a 1,000-year-old vampire going through their life and making choices and just cogitating, ruminating on what is that experience like. And that is an archetypal aspect of journaling games. They tend to be very introspective. They ask you, how does this character feel? How do you respond to this? So the simplest journaling game is just a series of writing prompts that let you dig into a character or identity, a place, a short, like little vignette, a moment in somebody's life, up to things that are much more involved. So there's another journaling game, they call it a keepsake game called Field Guide to Memory by Jian Shim and Xing Yin Kor. And links to all of them and to Field Guide to Memory are in there. This is a story where you are the mentee of a cryptid researcher who has gone missing. And in the course of making your journal, you're also challenged and invited to go out into the world to do crafts, to add art, to add found keepsake pieces into this journal that at the end of the game, you have this keepsake, you have created a story piece. There's another version or a sort of spin on that where you're not only like writing and responding to the prompts, but you're also doing cross stitch as part of the way of engaging with the game. So these can get really crafty as well in a way that breaks out of the box of just pen and paper journaling. So the core of a journaling game is you have a prompt that guides you to interact, to be the character, to think about what would that person do. And here's why I personally, as an old school tabletop gamer. I used to run Vampire the Masquerade LARPs at Origins and Gen Con and write characters for 250 people to get let loose for a 4-day event. Like, it was bonkers. But also some of the best improv acting like I've ever gotten to be part of. The solo aspect appeals because, I mean, finding time to be around people, and also kind of a massive introvert. But as a writer of fiction, recently, as the world has become much more aware of its diversities, we have become more conscious of trying to include as many voices as possible. There's a challenge with every character you make that, choices, who they could be, what they look like, how they interface with the world, that crystallizes as a point when you're creating more standard fiction. With a journaling game, you leave it up to the player exactly how diverse, how rich, how wild the world is. You don't have to close off very many doors or choices. And I think that's the thing that has appealed most to me. So when I was writing my game, which I think is why I'm doing this panel in the first place, Midnight's Kiss, which is pure vampire romance fan service. Like, I've written vampires, I've played vampires, I've directed things with vampires. I wanted to lean fully into all the tropes, and I wanted to write my own little vampire romance story. And I got completely hung up being an ace, intersex, masculine leaning person in a very complicated relationship who's kinky and queer, and just all of these things of that's pretty narrow. That's not going to have an appeal to everyone. So how do I write a story that has appeal to everyone? How could I create a story where everyone can have a sense of romance? And that's where storytelling and journaling game converged, because creating the framework of engagement, and that's what you're doing when you're making a journaling game. You're making a container for the story to unfold, and that story is very character driven and deeply driven by the personal experience and engagement and the way that the person connecting to that game relates to it. You allow them to define the limits, how just saying romance, many people are going to, oh, it's a game about sexy times, but I'm not into kissing, and I'm not into that. But I am into sexy vampires. So what shape does that take for you? And that's probably the core thing. What does that mean to you? I've got an additional background in psychology, so I think that's one of the other appeals, because your therapist is always going to ask you, but how does that make you feel? And there are moments, if you've gone through therapy or you are familiar with it, that when you're going through the prompts in a journaling game, you're like, some of this sounds a little bit like therapy. You're doing therapy with the character. You're asking them, how do they feel? What does this choice do? How does it change you? There's another person's name in there. They're not necessarily, well, some of their other games are Gothic, but their journaling game is not. Kira Magran's body hack is cyberpunk, and it is an exploration of our relationship with our body through the lens of someone who is undergoing a transhuman cybernetic enhancement. And you get to choose and then really meditate on, what does it mean to change your body? At what point are you the ship of Theseus? How much do you retain? Where is your identity? Where is your humanity? Who are you at the end of it when you change all of this? And does any of those changes, does any of that actually impact your sense of identity? What is this metamorphosis like? Those questions of, who am I? Why am I? And the wide open door of diversity is why this is an appealing thing to sort of like dig into. So since this is a little bit of a workshop, I want folks to think about, like, is there a story that you're working on? I know not everybody's a creative writer, but everybody's here for this wonderful wild weekend because we love vampires and queer content and just the intense relationships and interactions that can happen in Gothic literature, particularly. And Gothic literature lends itself perfectly to a journaling game because it's always about what's behind that door and what comes next, that sense of mystery and exploration, and also a twisting, unpredictable path that you won't always know how the story is supposed to end. It will take unforeseen turns that are incredibly intimate based on who's engaged with it. What story do you have in you that doesn't work as a traditional story? Because that's one of the other appeals of gaming and game writing for me. We have so many stories in us, and not all of them are comfortable in a traditional narrative style. Not everything is the next great vampire novel. Um, Not everything sits comfortably in a short story, or at least not in, save the cat format, if you're familiar with the traditional scripting, like plot points. Some of the stories that we want to tell in this genre are bigger and wilder and tangled like a briar patch. So, how do we unspool that and maybe allow it to be a framework instead, creating a world or a mood or a set of thought experiments that invite people to collaboratively engage with it? Uh, I get excited with solo journaling games, especially as we get close to NaNoWriMo, because they're also really good writing prompts and writing experiments. Like if you are hitting a point of writer's block and you're not the person who wants to create one of these games, picking something up that you can do in a couple of hours can get the juices flowing as well, where you are like, and maybe by the end you end up with a character that you can use somewhere. You might want to tell further stories, because it's always really the downside of role playing is you get into this character and you play the game, whether it's a tabletop game or a video game or whatever, and by the end of it you're very invested in this person and you want to tell more of their stories, and what other options do you have for that? So with role-playing games as collaborative storytelling, solo experiences leaning into introspection, motives, feelings, and journaling games that are in many ways like formalized writing prompts that are given just enough of a story structure to encourage an explorative experience that has at least a vague sense of a beginning, a middle, and an end. And then the final key is that there's random elements, there's moments of choice that are either an open-ended choice where the narrative stops. The person writing the game has created a scene, and then you're asked, okay, you're standing at the door in Bluebeard's castle. What do you do? And that's where the person engaged in the game is invited to do something. Or you get a branching narrative choice where the choice is defined for you. You are at the door at Bluebeard's castle. Do you open it? Go here in the sort of choose your own adventure thing. Do you walk away? Then you get a different answer for the story. Or to merge something from more familiar role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, randomized charts, where somebody will choose a way of determining. Dice are the most common because most people will have them. Some people use coin flips, some people use playing cards, tarot cards. Folks get really creative, but just like a little bullet pointed list of several different narrative choices that then form the prompt for, okay, you are at this point and here are 5 options. I usually do 6, and the 6th one is your choice. You get to fill it in. I will say that I like the randomized charts if you're very, very new to journaling games, because each of those bullet points, just reading through the different options, gives you ideas for what could happen. That also kind of sets the stage, sets the shape of what the writer is trying to create for this. So for creating your own, I mean, the first thing you got to answer is, what story do you want to tell? Obviously, we're here because we like spooky stuff and Gothic stuff and twisty things like long walks in graveyards with Mary Shelley that might end with wine at her mother's grave, or perhaps a little snogging, but not too much snogging because we don't want to offend Sam. Is it more the castle of a mad monk where there are horrible dungeons and torture and who knows what going on behind closed doors? Are you an orphan who has suddenly found an inheritance and now you have to explore that? But oh goodness, there's terrible things going on. I know it's a fun thing to lean into. You gave me ammo. I'm now going to toss it around. Also, I hated kissing until I met my wife. So everybody's got different things. So what is the story you want to tell? And then the next question with that is, who's your audience? Because your audience could just be you. Like that's the thing about games. I think for some people, when you're writing a game, it's a pastime, it's a hobby. We can get so invested in writing our novels, in writing our papers, in writing short stories, where like you have to do the thing and it needs to be very formal and professional. And of course, ultimately you're going to try to publish it somewhere. And while that's definitely a route you can go with a game, I think the very word game gives us a sense that there's a little more freedom to make it exactly what we want, something that feeds us, that gives us a little respite from the madding crowd and the wild world around us and all the things that are going on, and that can be only for us. With the side benefit of sometimes when you write something exclusively for you, exactly to your specifications, you will find that there's a whole lot of other people who love it too. That we're all weird together and we're not all as strange, or at least as exclusively irreparably and just unforgivably strange as some of us, I think, sometimes worry that we might be. So who is the audience? Who are you writing it for? Because that will determine a lot of choices of how the narrative gets put together, how long it is, how short it is. If you're just writing it for you, if you're just doing it as an experiment, then just feel free to be as wild and weird as you want to be. And then the key part about structure is, how does the narrative change? How do you drive the narrative forward? Because it is different from writing a short story or a novel. Like you still have a plot vaguely. You have an idea of like, you want the story to go to a concluded place. I'm going to use My Midnight's Kiss as an example, because it's just the easiest thing to lean into. It's literally, you get to romance a vampire. By the end, you have a vampire you are in love with, or at least in a relationship with. Individual results will vary for like, is this a happily ever after, a happily for now, a wow, that was a terrible idea, but it was fun for a time. But the overall goal is vampire. Ideally, at least long walks on the beach in the moonlight. 1,000-year-old vampire, the sort of like idea is in the title. That whole goal, that whole meditation is about time and change over time, and how time and experiences impact a person. Those narrative choices With Thousand-Year-Old Vampire, there's some random elements, but a lot of it's just journal prompts. Like literally you hit a point in the story of, okay, now what do you do? And you, as the person engaged with it, just answer questions. And it can be as brief or as in-depth as possible. You can write entire short stories simply as a response to one single prompt. And then that's one of the other things about these games is you get out exactly what you put in, and you can take an experience that's written for, you know, just a couple of hours for one person and like really deeply lean into it. But what if you want to play with a more random option? So traditional role-playing games, you know, one of the things that you see if you've watched Critical Role, if you've watched any of the actual plays, if you're familiar with D&D, watch Stranger Things, and the long scene with the bouncing D20. Most role-playing games will rely on dice. So not just your six-sided dice, but a baffling array, if you're not a gamer, of strange numbered dice, from dice with 10 sides, dice with 4 sides, which look like little pyramids and are the worst things in the world to step on aside from Legos. And dice give you a quick and easy thing that the majority of people who play games probably have around their house, but not everybody. Not everybody's going to have access to that. So access is also a thing to consider with this. Who has what? If you know your audience is just you, what do you have around the house? What do you engage with deeply as a way of randomizing choices? I think this has led to a whole profuse bunch of journaling games and other role-playing games that revolve around tarot decks now. Tarot decks have gotten like a huge boost because it's so easy to print decks of cards currently. A little bit harder the past couple of years with paper shortages and shipping shortages, but there was this tiny window where, like, if you wanted to put a deck of cards together, it was like this, and you would have them at your door. Telling stories and using the tarot as the journaling prompts is something that I've seen. I have seen people use decks of cards as the random element. And that can be as simple as just you draw a black card and you choose one thing, you draw a red card and you choose another thing, different suits. So instead of rolling a dice for like 4 options, you can use the deck of cards and simply use, like, did you pull a diamond? Okay, this is the answer you get. Did you pull a heart? This is the answer that you get. And you can use that to lean into things thematically. So if it's heart, maybe that's a choice. It's a little bit more about emotions. And if it's a diamond, maybe it's a choice. It's a little bit more about material things or wealth. And really the sky's the limit for that. Yeah, tarot decks, I'm like looking around because I've of course got one handy here, unplanned. But like the richness of tarot decks for storytelling, a little bit of weird stuff. I'm from middle of nowhere, Ohio. I went to a public school, but my creative writing teacher in high school did like psychic teas on Fridays. So we would move all the desks aside. We would sit on the floor, we would drink tea, and we would cast runes and play with tarot cards. This is a public school in the early 80s. Late 80s. Height of the Satanic Panic. And we still managed to get away with this. It didn't last very long, but it was the most amazing thing ever. But that was the first place I learned just the rich variety of stories that you can tell with a tarot deck. You have characters, you have built-in NPCs with a tarot deck, which does have an appeal for using it for gaming. It's just this handy, mythic bit of like folklore and story right in your pocket, divination aside. So depending on the deck, I've got the Londa Tarot, which I have described as sort of an intersection between Elf Quest and Labyrinth. in terms of art. It's, I guess, a fairly rare deck, but journaling games that use a tarot deck may not even use like a written prompt beyond do a draw, and then treat that card as a person that you have encountered along your path, and what conversation do you have with them. Again, sky's the limit for it, but you do want some limitations in those choices. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a narrative that can't contain itself. There's a temptation at first with all of the possibilities. If you're doing like a bullet pointed list of, at this point, Midnight's Kiss, like you go on a date with your vampire. Where do you go? Here's like, you go to the graveyard, you go to the creepy amusement park down the street that's open until 3 a.m. Do you just go out into the woods to a cabin and hang out? Do you do this? All of those things will flavor the story and potentially change what comes next. So when you're putting the story together, you have to have it open and adaptable enough that no matter where the person goes, the next step still makes sense, which is part of the challenge. There is a hybrid novel and journaling game that I'm working on called Lonely House, where I try to leave it as open-ended as possible. And I'm not sure if it will work. But that's the trick, is trying to make sure you can simultaneously leave as much space as possible for individual choice and also have a coherent, cohesive story. Lonely House is a classic exploration of, you've inherited a spooky house, congratulations, it's weird. There are elements of House of Leaves, very, very traditional, like Gothic, behind the doors change, like there's a locked door, there's a room that you can't get into, what's in there. And a lot of the story ultimately will be rocketing you to finally getting that unlocked and leaving the choice to the person who's engaged with the story thus far of what's next. How does that actually wrap up and end? In that particular narrative, what I chose, because there are points in the story where your option is to go forward and have something happen, or would your character actually get the heck out of the house? Because how many of us watch horror movies and there's the point where going down the basement is a terrible, terrible idea. And some of us will go down the basement anyway, even though we know it's a terrible idea, because maybe we're going to meet the monster. And, some of us might just make friends with the monster. Some of us might be the monster, and that's okay too. But if it's a character the person has made who just, as far as realism for them in that moment goes, they would not go through the door, leaving the option to, and here's where the story stops for that person. So what happens next for them if they have walked away and stopped engaging from it? So leaving that open as well as a possibility to maybe step back and disengage. Yeah, I know it's dangerous in here, but look. And also, like, there's so many books. I'm just going to go walk in there and, oh, look at the time. And it's dark again. And what is that creeping? And oh dear. I suppose I should mention that in my day job, I have to go blindfolded through abandoned prisons and hospitals and things and look for ghosts for people. So I have a very weird yardstick for what is going to get me to turn back from a scary place. If there's books, I mean, really, like, we're all just going to be there. Okay. So I'm trying not to get all tangenty, but I also really like the tangents, like the Yeah, so journaling games and the Gothic and the stories that we tell. I think the big challenge, if this is something that you want to like play around with, is again trying to come up with a structure that is adaptable enough and malleable enough that it does allow for a person to breathe. Sometimes that means hacking what we think a story is. You know, my agent will always come back like it doesn't have a plot. It doesn't have a plot. Like what's going on? There's just people talking. But sometimes that's fun too. Like sometimes we just want to lean into people talking or lean into what is this person like. In writing role-playing games, character creation is a pretty big part of every role-playing game, especially like the dice and paper tabletop ones. Uh, Sometimes notoriously so, where like creating your character can take an entire session for most people. Hours. Some of us will invest weeks into writing backstory and like getting the, what do they look like? What do they like? What a journaling game can simply be character creation. Who are you? And then all of the prompts that encourage a person to build a rich character with their personality traits and their strengths and their weaknesses, where they come from, what woes they carry, how they have gotten around the scars that their past has inflicted on them, or how they haven't. And I see that I'm not the only one, but like for me, that character creation is some of the most engaging part of most games. It's also like when I play computer games, I will get hung up on just the start screen of like the tiny little choices of like, what hairstyle do you stick on this person? Because that's a story in itself. The lack of choices is often a story also. Um, Gaming is a complicated thing for those of us who are storytellers by nature, because I can pick up pretty much any computer game and it's not necessarily a role-playing game, but there's still going to be story if there's a character that I'm playing. Like I don't connect to that character if there isn't some personality there, and I start making it, I automatically start making it based on like what their abilities are and how, what does their armor look like and all of these ridiculous things. And we can use that. We can take that. Like there's no reason not to treat that as a game by itself, as an engaging experience, a creative journey that may have no point beyond just the thought experiment of who is this person in this moment right now? What do they want? And maybe that's a character that you can use as an NPC in another game. Maybe that's a character that you can use in a novel down the line. But I really want to stress, you don't have to commodify it. That's another appeal for gaming with me. As somebody who's a professional writer, we are driven to commodify everything. Um, I stuck my face up on the map because my whole life is public. I'm on TV. So everything is commodified. Like I talk, it's commodified. I write, it's commodified. Gaming can give us a place that is just for us. Uh, I think it's a place where a lot of people will go for with fan fiction as well, because there's no chance where you're really going to be, you can't make money off of it. You're not writing it for publication. You're writing it for pure enjoyment. You're writing it because it's a story you want to tell. It's a story that lives in you. It's a story you want to see in the world. The shape of something that couldn't exist without your engagement with this original source material. So as we are, here at the end of a weekend where we have delved into, scholarly papers and theories about character and story and vampires and society and identity. I want to kind of bring us to a moment where we also think about us and how we engage with these and why, and how it doesn't have to be anything more than a story that speaks to us, that there's value in that, even if it's not something that you submit and somebody might give you an award for it, or you're going to get paid, or you're going to get published. Like, you don't have to have it be something on your resume. That freedom with games and gaming is the freedom to simply indulge in something for the sake of doing it, because it feeds your soul, because it stirs your creativity. And I think allowing yourself those moments of indulgence builds up your arsenal of strength and vision and creativity for the other things that you do have to commodify, the other things that you do want to share and put out in the world, and that do sometimes require you to fit into a certain structure or a certain expectation for how this story or thought or theory is going to be presented. But within the realm of a journaling game, anything goes. I want to go to, like, just bounce some stuff off of me. Or not, but engage. Like, does this appeal? Have you ever gamed before? Do you have questions? Is this something that you're like, I don't understand, I still don't get? Or honestly, just process. I would love to hear stuff.